Implicit bias. What is it? It's what you just did. It's what you always do. But don't worry, everyone does it and we just can't help it. Implicit bias is actually a cognitive function, not a prejudice. It's the framework through which each of us initially processes a given experience or encounter. You likely had an idea or preconception of what you thought implicit bias was before you even clicked to play this video. You also likely had some ideas about me when you heard my voice. Implicit bias is not a bad thing. Think of it as a starting point that we set unconsciously when we have any sort of experience. Our life experience creates bias and informs that starting point for how we begin to understand anything we encounter and do. And everyone has different life experience that informs their starting point. More specifically, before you start to do anything, your brain makes several decisions about the situation, your role and where you stand, what you are dealing with, what to expect, and what you should do or shouldn't do next. Implicit bias happens so quickly, and we're so efficient at it that we rarely are aware when it's happening. Implicit bias is useful to a point. As you might imagine, unless we move beyond our initial bias, we are only going to be prepared for our most recent past experience or social encounter. And we would have finite limits to how we experience any new situation or person. Implicit bias can be especially problematic in dealing with people who aren't just like who we are. We can easily understand people who are the same gender or age or have a similar lifestyle to ours, to a point. We are less able to as quickly understand the differences we perceive in others, and the lack of understanding can affect our personal, casual, and professional relationships unless we're able to move past what we already know. Unless it's managed, implicit bias can affect how fairly we treat others, without realizing that we are functioning with that bias. I know, it's frustrating because you are well-intended. So how do you manage implicit bias? Start by realizing and honoring that it's just your starting point. Then be mindful. Step back and allow the situation to unfold as you process it. Here's a tip on how to do that. Create an internal dialogue about what you are experiencing, including your emotional responses, and refer to yourself in the third person while you reflect on and describe your initial experiences. This may sound cumbersome, but psychology supports it. Referring to yourself in the third person, particularly while you're articulating emotional responses, helps you in removing extraneous bias and judgment, and you'll learn a lot. When you are interacting with someone whom you initially perceive as different from you or what you're used to, or perhaps someone who represents a stigmatized group, focus on and respond to your concrete observations rather than relying on gut feelings, which, as you know now, are drawing from your implicit bias. Notice the decisions you are making and your behaviors, and consider the extent to which you might be responding to implicit bias or even stereotypes. While paying attention to and managing your initial responses, invite new understanding. Make an intention to be open-minded and willing to learn. Approach each person as an individual and assess the personal traits that make them the person they are. Key points. Everyone has implicit bias. It's inherent and unavoidable. Implicit bias is based on one's life experience. You can manage implicit bias by paying attention to your initial responses. Sort out your own thoughts by taking yourself through your processes in the third person. Make an effort to assess and think about each person as an individual. Be willing to learn about others and yourself in the process.